So you've got a podcast, but you have no idea how to make it grow or monetize it. You've come to the right place. The Turnkey Podcast will give you the best tips on how to create a professional podcast. Whether you want to grow your audience, your influence, your bank account, or all of the above, this is the podcast for you. Now, here's your host, Doug Sandler.
As the host of two podcasts, the Domain Name Wire podcast and the Podcast Guest Show featuring Andrew Allemann, he understands how essential fine-tuning your marketing is to build a community. Tons of success. Boy, I was going to say sex. Where is my brain? I don't know, Andrew. Tons of success and hundreds of episodes to his credit. You'll see that we all still have the work in progress sign right above our head. Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Hey, I love having you here, and I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom on our panel conversation. We were talking about, really working your podcast from both sides of the microphone, guest and host. And then as I was thinking about it, as we're in the middle of this panel conversation a couple of weeks ago, I thought, man, what a great guest for our Turnkey podcast, because you really do have experience from both sides, and really from the hosting side. You have like 300 and some odd episodes of one show. I know you have a second show that's brand new.
Right.
So maybe we start just with sharing a little bit of what your two shows are about, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, sure. So the Podcast Guests, actually, let me start with the other one. The Domain Name Wire podcast is my longest running one. Coming up, I think this week I did episode 385, 386, and that's a weekly. So divide that by 52, you're looking at 6-7 years of doing that show. And that's about domain names. So there's a subset of the population. It's a business where people buy and sell domain names. Some of my audience includes companies like GoDaddy. I might have a guest from GoDaddy, which a lot of people get their domain names from. We talk about legal issues. We talk about sales. We talk about policy. We talk about anything that impacts that business. So super insider baseball for that industry. And then my other podcast, as you mentioned, is brand new. I'm actually working on the third episode today, and that's the Podcast Guests Show. And that is a companion to the podcastguest.com platform. And I created that show because I wanted a longer format way to communicate with people about the benefits of being guests on shows and best practices and that sort of thing.
So let's start with that second show, the Podcast Guests podcast show. Let's connect that business or that podcast to your existing business that you have.
Right. So podcastguest.com is a free platform that connects podcasters with guests for their shows. We have over 35,000 people that use it. And twice a week, I send out an email with 10 podcasts that are looking for guests and exactly what they're looking for. And then people pitch to be on those shows. And so in that newsletter, sometimes I give tips and suggestions on ways to be a better host or a better guest. And I really wanted, people mostly open up that email to see the new list of podcasts, right? So even if I put a paragraph or two at the top of it, with a suggestion, most people are going to kind of glance over that. So I decided to create a podcast where I could go more in depth and kind of tell the stories. As you know, podcasting is a much more intimate medium than, say, a blog post, right? And we're talking 20, 30, 40 minutes long, where you can really go in depth on topics. So that was my reason for creating that.
So but there was a reason behind the reason, though, I think, and maybe you can get a little bit more detailed about that. What was the reason why you even started it to begin with? Weren't you in the process of trying to figure out what shows to pitch yourself? Was that the origin story of that?
A podcastguest.com. Yeah. So for my Domain Name Wire podcast, it was great for the first year. And then it's a guest format. And then I pretty much tapped out my Rolodex. And I was like, okay, who's next? Who's going to be on my show? And so I looked out there. I said, surely there's kind of an easy way to find guests for your show. And at the time, the only option were really agencies, which are great. They're kind of a do-it-for-me service, but they're also expensive, $500 to a couple $1,000s per show, typically, to get people booked on there. And so I was like, well, certainly there's got to be a way to make a simple free platform that podcasters can use. And so I started emailing some podcasters saying, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. I'm having this problem. Maybe you are too. Are you interested? And the result was overwhelmingly yes. And so we started really small, just a couple hundred of us on there on this platform, getting the emails every week. And then it's as I mentioned earlier, it's grown a lot since then.
So tell me a little bit about that growth curve. I just made a post on Facebook today. Nice Guys on Business has now been around for almost 1,300 episodes of that show. It's incredible, but a little bit less time. We just did more volume in those early years.
Sure.
We do 2 episodes a week now, but we were up to 5 episodes a week early on in our run, because we had so much content and so many people that were interested in being in that guest seat. So the point of that was, when I made that post today, it showed this hockey stick graph of growth, which was so flat for the first almost year and a half or so, and then all of a sudden it just completely shot up. The right timing, the right guests, the right social media posts, the right influencer being on the show. I don't know. I can't, to tie back success to one specific thing. But what did that journey look like for you? You had a couple hundred people, and when did it get to the point where you said, "Holy wow, I have 35,000 people on this list now"? When did you realize it was going to be a hit?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because it was slow at first. And when you think about how, if you're growing by word of mouth primarily, you think about how that does become kind of an exponential equation, right? So if one person tells another person, and then that person tells 2 people, and then they tell, and then you kind of get this growing out from there. I would say, the first few years, from a business standpoint, it wasn't all that interesting, right? Like, from money coming in from creating this. And I didn't know how I was going to make money when I started it.
Right.
It was just like, hey, let's start this, let's see what happens, and then take off. And then, but I would say there were different inflection points. The pandemic was definitely an inflection point where it, doubled over a year, as so many people started creating podcasts, and people kind of changed how they were interacting with people, because we couldn't get together in person. So, the revenue, and probably I wouldn't say the membership base, but the revenue definitely doubled, since the beginning of the pandemic. So I would say it's kind of like a hockey stick, but those things don't keep going up forever. And sometimes you can't tell what it is. On my Domain Name Wire podcast, it was steadily getting, say, 750 downloads per episode. And then over the course of 4 or 5 months, it kind of doubled to where it was getting about 1,500. And it's frustrating as a podcaster, because you can't always tell where that's coming from. It's like, okay, I see where they're downloading it, but I don't know who they are, other than the personal feedback you get, which is just a small percentage of people that listen, right?
Sometimes when we take on a new production client, especially some of our premium level clients that are spending, close to $1,000 a month on production, we feel like we have a stopwatch counting down, or a countdown timer. At some point, success has to find them, or they have to be patient enough to realize that podcasting is a marathon, not a sprint. And so we really do emphasize, and not because we're trying to sell them into more time with being a client of ours, but the reality of it is, I think what you experienced with your newsletter and what we experienced with the Nice Guys on Business is fairly typical of the podcast market, or really even the entrepreneur game. It's like an overnight success in 40 years. You put out this long line of breadcrumbs, and you're like, oh my gosh, will anybody, chip on the, will peck away at the breadcrumbs? Just follow me. And then all of a sudden you turn around and you have this army of people that are like, hey, can you bake some bread for me? Right. So what advice would you share for the philosophy of podcasting is a marathon, not a sprint?
Yeah, kind of an interesting thing to look at there is at Podcast Movement last year, Rob Walsh of Libsyn was sharing a lot of data. And he pointed out that, he looked at the number of active shows and how it really hasn't grown during the pandemic. A number of new shows started, but then they quit. And he showed, it was pretty compelling. He showed right at about 50 episodes, people were quitting. And he said, what happens is they're at a year, they're looking back, and they're like, either they aren't making the money they were hoping for, or they aren't getting the audience they were hoping for. So they quit, right? They give up.
Yep.
And podcasting, it's really hard. It's not like a blog post where it can go viral and all of a sudden you have all these people on your site, or it gets slurped up by Google and you've got the right keywords in there and all of a sudden people are coming to it. Podcasting is a slower game. Now, the audience you build is very dedicated and very devoted to you, but it takes a while to grow that audience. And so it's amazing how many podcasts start and then quit before 10 episodes. One of the things we do before we feature a podcast in our newsletter, most of them have a lot more episodes, but they have to have at least 10, because I don't know if someone's committed to it until they get to at least 10 episodes, right? And so I also, thinking back to what you were saying, you were doing a daily show at first. I would tell people to maybe not do that.
Well, we didn't start there. We kind of built up to it. We did a once a week show, then it was 2 days a week, and then 3, and then 5, and then we held that 5 for probably 2 or 3 years, and we just said, we're overwhelming our audience. It's too much.
They don't have enough time to listen. But there's also the question of, can you keep that up, physically and mentally as a host? And so I always like to under promise, over deliver, start with a weekly, like you said. And then if it makes sense to go 2x a week, then you can do that. If your audience is asking for it, if you have the time. On my podcast guest show, I've actually started with every other week, because I'm like, hey, I'm just going to get this out there, see how the audience responds. Are people listening? Are they providing feedback? What do they think about it, before I commit to going every week on it?
So let's talk about not the concept of your shows, but the philosophy behind the marketing of it, and not the marketing of your show, but why domain names, why that specific market, and then why podcast guest market. I mean, these are such fine-tuned markets that you were appealing to. Was that by happenstance, or was that something that you just said you really focused on making sure that you micro niche down to that specific audience?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. With domain names, I just really enjoy it, right? And it's a small community, but it's a really tight-knit community. But look, I started a blog, a trade publication, online trade publication for that industry back in 2005. And had I started, say, a general technology site or a general business site, I would have been a very small fish in a big pond, lots of competition, and would not have gotten traction from it. So by you say niche, I say niche.
Yeah, same idea. I have no idea.
Along regardless. I've looked this up before, because I'm like, someone's going to be right. And the dictionary says both are right. So I'm like, okay. So, if you really, and I see this too on people that join podcastguest.com, if they go too broad, no one invites them to be a guest. If you say you're a business coach, there are a million of those out there, or an author. It's more, okay, what do you write about? What do you coach about? Get more specific. If, let's say we had a medical podcast, and a lot of our listeners were doctors' offices, dentists, that sort of thing. And we had a choice between a business coach and a business coach that focuses only on medical practice. Who are we going to take? Who are people going to want to listen to? Right. And so, I'm a big fan of narrowing down the niche that you're going after, so that you can be a big fish in a small pond.
I love that. And I think it's such great advice also. And one of the things we really do chat with our and coach our clients on when they first start their podcast, and they're not 100% sure how to title the show or what the show is even going to be about. We do really emphasize the idea of going down as tight as you can into that niche, because the closer that you can get to pay dirt, the more likely you're going to be to strike gold. It's really hard, like you said, for a general business show. And our Nice Guys on Business podcast, which is a great example of this, we had a large audience, but we couldn't really fine tune it through a call to action to get them to take any action. There was too many people listening to the show. It was hard for us to figure out what they want. And we look at that podcast, and I think every time we put out a call to action, we may get 2 or 3 people to take advantage of that call to action. I have another show, and I've used this as an example a lot of times on our Nice Guys show, the Mustang podcast, the mustangpodcast.com. It's about first generation Mustangs only, which is such a tight niche. I can almost say 98% of the people that listen to the show are men between the ages of 50 and dead. It's an older audience. And if we throw up a call to action on that podcast, we may get 20 to 40% response conversion to something. And so you take 1,000 people, and now all of a sudden you put out a call to action, you have 200 to 400 people opting into something you have. Man, it really does bode well for the idea of micro niching. 100% works for your message.
It's interesting. I have some podcasters on podcastguest.com who I see them inviting guests, and they're like, hey, we started focused on this topic, but we're broadening our topic. And I want to write back, no. Don't broaden. The reason you're not getting the audience you're looking for is because you're too broad. Become narrower, right? Because, now maybe they started with talking about, let's keep on our medical theme, something medical, right? And then they're like, oh, but this isn't any fun, and we're not getting the audience. So let's invite entertainers and former football players. And it's like, okay, but who's going to listen to that every week? Right. Unless you are a star interviewer and you already have an audience, no one's going to come listen to that super broad podcast.
Great advice. Great advice. Share a little bit about your journey in terms of the line that you have been on. Has it been a straight line from where you started to where you are now? Or has it been like our nice guys in our business, which are connected and they've been crazy as hell and crooked as anything could possibly, more crooked than Lombard Street in San Francisco?
Right. Right. Well, I mean, I think just looking at, say, podcastguest.com as an example, I started that in 2016, so 6 years ago, and I didn't know the direction it was going to go. I didn't know how I was going to monetize it. I figured it'd be advertising. That's what I know from the domain name space and my publication there. But then I listened to what the audience was asking for, right? And over time, they're like, hey, can we do this? Is there a way to feature ourselves as guests in your newsletter and then on your site and that sort of thing? So it is kind of crooked that way. And as I mentioned, the first few years of that business, it made some money, but it wasn't really interesting, right? And it was worth the time to me because I enjoyed doing it and I was creating a community, but financially speaking, it didn't make a lot of sense. Whereas now it's turned into a full-fledged business.
So one of the questions I ask on all of our guest applications for Turnkey Podcast is, what was your initial goal for getting started in the podcasting space? Was it to grow your community, build your influence, to make money, start a revolution? What was your answer? Do you remember?
Yeah. So, on the Domain Name Wire podcast, I was looking around and I had a blog for almost 10 years. And the blogs in the domain name industry kind of replaced a lot of the forums. So everyone would talk in forums and then people moved to blogs. And, YouTube came around, all these different media. And you see the people that didn't change and move with the times and they become stagnant and their business dies, right? So it's like, hey, a lot of people like reading. That's great. But I want to have some longer format conversations rather than these short blog posts. And I want to diversify how I'm reaching people, right? So it's not just what they're seeing, it's what they're hearing too. And now they can take Domain Name Wire with them on their commute or when they're out mowing the lawn or when they're working out, that sort of thing. Ways that they could interact with my platform without, with my media, without necessarily being sitting in front of their phone or their laptop. So, it's kind of like the move from regular desktop to mobile, and Facebook had to make that big jump because they saw people were, and so that was really it. I wanted to have longer format conversations with people. So 30-minute conversations. And I also wanted to make sure that I didn't become stagnant.
So I want to get your input on this because I keep coming back to what I talk to my coaching clients about when it comes to podcast production and launching a show and where do I find the time to podcast and what's my podcast going to be about? And we go through the entire just discovery call. One of the areas that I very much focus on is your podcast a spoke on your wheel, or is it the hub of your wheel? Meaning, is it another thing that you do in the course of your day, or is it something that you run all of your business opportunities through? In your particular, and I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer. There's just an answer. So what do you consider your podcast? A spoke on the wheel, another thing, or the hub of your wheel where everything runs through it?
Yeah, I would say a spoke because I have an audience and now I'm bringing them to the podcast, right? On Domain Name Wire, I had an audience and then I brought them to the podcast as opposed to creating my audience through the podcast. And I don't know if that's exactly what you're saying there, but that's generally how I look at it. It's kind of part of it. And people that have a big audience can bring them into a podcast and make that, that hub, if you will. But I think it can be quite challenging if that's your starting point.
Yeah, it's really hard. We are all so unlike folks like Tim Ferriss or Joe Rogan. Very few of us have communities of the thousands, let alone have communities in the millions. So for us, we started without an audience. We had 7 downloads on our first episode. I go back and look at that first 30 days. I'm like,
cousins, your siblings.
Exactly. It was like, okay, my mom listened. I had to get her phone and teach her how to listen to a podcast. So I know that was one of them.
Download the app, Mom.
I'm like, oh my gosh, it was just such a struggle. And then I go back to that hockey stick and think, in that first 2 years, we did about 500,000 downloads, which was great. But in the first year, it was in the few thousands. So it was that whole second year that we did it. And then from 500,000 to 1 million took a fraction of the time. And then from 1 million to a little over 4 million, where we are now, we don't even count anymore. It's not because there's any ego in it. It's because we really don't focus on audience growth as our business development model. Our business development model comes from the relationships, believe it or not, that we build out of that guest seat. I mean, that's how we got together. I know there's stuff that we can potentially do in the future as well. And I don't know that, and no offense, you probably have never listened to my shows, and that's okay.
I did once you invited me to be a guest on your show. You gained a new listener.
That's good. That's good. I appreciate you saying so. There's one more listener. So we get our downloads 4 million one at a time. We need 4 million guest seats.
Invite them on your show. And then, yeah, it's I think podcasting, as you mentioned earlier, it's a bit of a long game. It can be frustrating because you don't necessarily know where the growth is coming from. But I think if you focus on creating a good quality show, and I think if you think about what your goals are, right? And so we've mentioned this on that panel and such. I mean, downloads per episode is great, but as you mentioned on your Mustang one, you get so much response, even if the numbers are lower. And the thing that makes me cringe, or the biggest predictor of someone will stop doing their podcast, is if they say, I'm going to grow a huge audience and sell ads on my podcast. I'm going to be the next Joe Rogan. That's pretty much, I'm like, all right, that's not going to work. Yeah. Right. And for some people, it could work out. But if you look at the relationships you create, if you look at building your own community and audience through it as your primary things, then I think you'll be much happier with the results.
So Blue Sky, your goals for both of your shows. What if you had that magic wand and you could say, man, check that out. Look where I've arrived. You can throw ego in here if you want to as well. Where would you be with podcasting if you Blue Sky the goals?
With the shows, with the new podcast guest show, obviously I do want to start to grow that amongst my audience, right? And I want to get people listening and writing into me. That's at the point where I know that, hey, people are listening and they're internalizing or taking action based on this. I don't have particular number goals there. On my Domain Name Wire podcast, I mean, are there really more than 1,500 to 2,000 people that are interested in this topic? I don't know. So when I see that number, I'm like, yeah, I'm not trying to necessarily grow that. I'll tell you though, with that, what's interesting is, and for people that aren't in a very a niche business, they might not understand this, but we have conferences just for domain name people that I go to. And what was fascinating is a couple of years after starting my podcast, I assumed everyone came to my blog first and then started listening to the podcast. Right. But I had people coming up saying, oh yeah, I love your podcast. They never go to the blog, right? It's just, that's how they like to consume things, through the podcast. And so it was kind of interesting to see that. And it really validates that idea of, hey, I don't want to grow stale just writing and having an online trade publication. I need to reach people through other media.
Yeah. And I would say, going back to that original thing that you said about, one of your goals for your newsletter would be to have people write in and share comments. And obviously that would be a really great way to connect the two things. It's just that if you take that hub philosophy, for lack of better terms, since we used that before, if you take that hub philosophy and you just say, hey, the newsletter, access to that is via this podcast that we have, access to the podcast is through the newsletter, and you combine the two so that one, your right hand knows exactly what your left hand is doing. Obviously the name of the podcast and your newsletter, very similar. So it makes sense. It's just a matter of, man, if they can't differentiate the two, then you make it impossible for them to be a part of one without the other. Imagine having, you have 35,000 people subscribe to your newsletter. Imagine having 35,000 downloads every episode of your podcast guest.
Yeah, just listening to that, I'm like, I could say, hey, one of the podcasts that you can pitch to be a guest on, I'm not going to put in a newsletter. It's in the podcast, right? So go listen to the podcast,
Totally.
and I'll include a link in there. And then it's just kind of like a bonus, right?
Yep.
For them that gets them to go there. So that's a really good idea. Thank you.
Well, good.
I don't know if you're trying to create an idea for me, but
no. Well, that's what it is. I mean, a lot of times what happens is, I mean, you are so close to it, Andrew, that oftentimes you don't see it. Somebody could say to me, "Hey, have you ever thought about, I don't know, have you ever thought about TikTok?" And I'm like, TikTok as a way to promote my Mustang podcast. They're 80 years old. I can't even get them to go over to, they're talking to their grandkids on Facebook. That's where my jam is, and Instagram for the youngers to see some of the photos that we have. But we are so close to it for our own selves. No ego in this. Those that are listening to this either live on Facebook right now or in the replay on Turnkey, you guys are so close to it that the whole idea of having a buddy, I don't care whether you hire a coach like me or get involved in a podcast newsletter like Andrew's to hear and see and read and listen to more information. But when you live in a vacuum, it's really hard to see outside of the blackness that vacuum has created. You've got to do something to expand your reach.
Very true.
Hidden gift. Tell me some hidden gift or gifts that you have gotten from podcasting. And when I say gifts, I'm not talking about all of the probably signed books and stuff and freebies that you have gotten, but what have been some of the things that you didn't anticipate that you would get out of podcasting that you now have been able to say, I didn't think about that, but yeah, that's a great gift that I've gotten from it.
Well, if I hadn't started the Domain Name Wire podcast, I never would have thought to create podcastguest.com, which has become a gift as a business, right? And, another thing I'd say is just the really interesting people that you get to meet. I interviewed on my Domain Name podcast, the bassist for Megadeth. I was going to say Metallica, needed to say Megadeth. I was like, oh, wait, they're two of those thrash metal bands from when I was a kid. Where, he had sat on a plane next to a friend of mine and they started talking, and he talks about, we created the first website for a band back in the 90s, whatever. And he's like, you got to talk to my friend Andrew. And he came on the show. And then that led into someone in the industry heard it, who ran a conference, and he's like, let's have this guy to our conference and we can talk about the early days of the web and that sort of thing. So I got to interview that person on stage for that. So I think it really opens up a lot of doors. And, you have conversations with a lot of people that otherwise you wouldn't, as you mentioned earlier on this show. And a lot of those can open doors for you, or they can entertain you. They can be people you idolize, that if you just reached out and say, I'm a fan, can we talk for 20 minutes? They're going to say no. But if you say, I'm a fan, I'd love to introduce you to my podcast audience, then you're giving something to them, right? So
absolutely. And you've been podcasting since, did you say when did it start? 2001?
Let's see, this iteration I think was 2014, if I'm doing the math right. Maybe it was 2016 then. Well,
that's okay. That's all right. It's been
but I did a previous iteration before, most people call it podcast. It was radio, right? Domain Name Wire Radio. And and then I quit because it was a pain to do that back in the day. And it's gotten easier, right? To do these things. There are services like yours that'll manage it. And there are more tools and systems out there. So it's a lot easier to do.
So that my audience can see that you're a normal guy in a normal world. What's your full-time gig? What do you do regularly? And where do you hope to have that go if nobody in that gig is listening right now?
Yeah. So I haven't worked for anyone in many years. And so my domain name trade publication and podcast guests are what I do to make money. So that's kind of my business, if you will.
So those that are in our community, you can see through that answer alone that podcasting and the tentacles that it creates or that created the podcast are absolutely a good way for you to put everything together. If you have a full-time gig right now and you're trying to figure out, man, I've just created 10 episodes, I don't really see this going anywhere, just hang with it just a little bit longer. So many people do that pod fade thing at around episode 10 and they quit. And then at 50 episodes in, they're looking back about a year into it, and you guys are 3 feet from gold. You are truly 3 feet from gold. Please do not quit podcasting. I'm not saying that as a self-serving thing because I want you guys to stay in our production. Yeah, it's great. I'd love to continue to have you as a client. But at the same time, don't give up on the things that you started your podcast to begin with, if those things are near and dear to you.
Doug, I think about both my businesses, and I was approached fairly on about potentially selling them, and I ended up not doing it. And I'm very thankful, right? Because they took off after that, right? It's creating it and getting it going are a lot of work, but once you see it through and you hit that inflection point, it can be very valuable.
Andrew, thank you for sharing with our turnkey community today. Thanks for sharing all of your wisdom, and I'm looking forward to seeing more great things from both of your shows and your business as well. Thanks for hanging out with us today.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to the Turnkey Podcast. If you like the show, please rate, recommend, and review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. Yes, that's the call to action. Make sure to include one on your show also. You can get more valuable advice at turnkeypodcast.com.